Morning everyone, thank you for getting up so bright and early on a Friday morning. I think that by the end of this week your brains must be getting a little bit addled, and I don't know why we didn't call Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services addled. Atoms just seem to roll off the tongue much more easily than that. So in this session today we're going to be talking about Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. If I use the word atom, I'll put a penny in the little jar and I'll take you all out to a beer afterwards. What I want to cover in this session is really the positioning and usage of Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, go through some of the installation and deployment options, cover some of the terminology, talk about the schema, talk about some of the security, the tools, and really what we're going to do through this whole presentation is actually do a complete start to finish installation, configuration and usage of Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. Now the important thing to note is, and hopefully you've been attending some of the IDA track sessions here, is that at Microsoft we've got a comprehensive strategy for identity and access management. And really what we're focusing on today is just one of those areas, which is Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. But as you can see here, we've got a comprehensive strategy for doing things like how to provision and maintain the entitlements for electronic identities using Identity Lifecycle Manager. We've got our PKI platform, Active Directory Certificate Services, which really forms the foundation for a lot of other key technologies that we use. So for example, network access protection, IPsec, we can bootstrap each of those using certificates. So certificate services becomes quite important. We've also got rights management services, which allows you to maintain information protection for documents and other items and have that protection persist over the life cycle for that. We have federation services that allow two organizations to share and securely transfer information and trust between one another. And then at the foundation level, we have the Active Directory services, both Active Directory Domain Services, which is what we use, which is the product we used to refer to as AD or Active Directory, and Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. So really, what's the positioning for Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services? It is just an LDAP compatible directory. There's nothing magical about that. It's built on exactly the same technology foundation as Active Directory itself. So it uses exactly the same underlying database store, so the Enterprise Storage Engine or ESE, that in fact is even the same engine that we use in Exchange Server. So very robust, very scalable database store. And sitting on top of that we have again things like the LDAP protocol heads, and it provides all the same functionality as Active Directory. It's got the same replication model, uses the same schema extensions, so it really has a lot of the underlying foundations that we've used in Active Directory. Some of the things that really differentiate it from Active Directory is, first of all, it's independent of Active Directory domains. So you can install Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services on a standalone machine or in a workgroup. There's no dependency on a domain. We can also install multiple instances on a single machine. So I can have multiple LDAP directories, obviously listening over different ports on a single machine. It has an extensible schema just like Active Directory, but one of the subtle differences is we can use X500 style naming. So instead of Active Directory where we use DC equals contoso, DC equals com, using the DC style name or the domain context style name, in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services we can use X500 name using, say, countries and organizations. So I can have organization equals contoso, country equals Great Britain. So it allows me to really integrate and interoperate with existing X500 style naming conventions. As I said, we can operate it in a workgroup or on a single machine. In terms of if we want to have multiple instances replicating together, again, just like Active Directory, I can have multiple Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instances replicating with one another. And they use exactly the same replication engine that Active Directory uses, so you can build quite complex topologies using concepts like bridgeheads and have that replicating around a large network. And really the whole idea of Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services is to provide an LDAP compatible directory for the typical directory applications that we've used in the past. Things like an intranet directory, or perhaps you want to have a specific application directory, or for use on the extranet. Let me just show you some schematics of how these might look. So in terms of an internal directory where we might be using a white pages, I might have a number of different stores, so maybe a database contains some HR information, a text file that may have come from a PBX system in a directory. I might aggregate those using a directory synchronization product such as Identity Lifecycle Manager, or a third-party product for that matter. Aggregate that information and store it in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. That gives me an aggregated view of different information throughout the organization that I can then expose, for example, in this case, to users using an address book or their mail or white pages address book, or even publish that through some web pages and provide them with browser access to a directory service. Another example is using it as an application directory. So in this case, I might use the store to maintain, for example, user credentials. I can use that for web single sign-on applications. So most of the web single sign-on applications can be back-ended by a LDAP directory, and Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services is perfectly suited for those types of applications. I can do things like URL authorization for web pages. So it really gives me a very rich directory service that can protect the front end of a web application. More importantly, at the business logic layer, I can start to use it to also build up my rules and business logic. So I might do some authorization checks based on queries that I submit to the directory. Finally, the third scenario is as an extranet directory. And again, I can use the directory service to do things like being a membership provider. It stores all the credentials and details of, in this case, perhaps external customers who connect in via a website and store their membership information on the directory service. So any type of scenario where you've thought of using a directory service, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services is a perfectly suitable directory for those types of applications. So let's just go through some terminology for Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. So the first thing to note is there's this concept of an instance, and we can run multiple instances on a single machine. So what that really means is that I can have, let's say, two instances. One instance can be listening on port 5000, another one on port 6000. They all have different service names. They don't interfere with one another. They both have separate schemas and separate configurations. So I can actually host, as I've got here, two different instances on the same server. The next important thing to note is that we have partitions in each instance. We obviously have a schema partition that holds the schema information. We have the configuration information, which is how the different servers have been configured. And more importantly, if we're using replication, it stores some of the replication topology information. And then we actually have the application partition itself, where we store, for example, user information. So what I've got here is, for example, the configuration, the schema, and the application partition. Just one thing to note is that we use a GUID to uniquely identify the schema and configuration containers in each of the instances. We have a couple of roles in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. You may be familiar with the FSMO roles in Active Directory. We have two of those roles in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, a schema FSMO and a naming FSMO. And they're both designed to prevent conflicts if you're updating the schema or if you're updating or creating different instances. So they perform the same role that those equivalents perform in Active Directory. And then we can configure what we call a configuration set, and that is where all the different instances share the same, for example, replication information. So they share their replication topology and they'll replicate with one another. So all I'm showing here is I've got two servers, that's over there, that's over there. They both have two instances, which just for the sake of it I've called the same, Atom Instance 1 and Atom Instance 1 there. They share the same application partition, the same schema and configuration partition, and they will replicate with one another. So it gives you a very reliable directory service because I can now start to have multiple directory services where the information is replicated between them And from an application perspective, you don't have a single point of failure. Let's just do a very quick comparison between Active Directory domain services and Active Directory lightweight directory services. In Active Directory domain services, a couple of the key things to note here is we have the directory system agent, the security accounts manager, and sitting on top of that we have what I call the heads. So LDAP is the LDAP protocol head, MAPI is the messaging API head, so for example, applications like Exchange. We have the replication head, we have the Kerberos, the key distribution center, and we have the LANman head, which provides compatible access for the down-level APIs. So the old NT-style domain APIs work through here. As you can see, there's some interdependencies between the directory system agent and SAM. So for example, when you change your password using an old NT-style API, it'll come in through SAM and eventually go through into the directory system agent and onto the directory. If I come in and change my password through LDAP, it will go through DSA. SAM actually is the thing that enforces my password uniqueness, depending on what your policies are, and then again, the information will get written back. There are also some dependencies on domain name services, the file replication service, and group policy. So Active Directory publishes records in DNS, so clients and other applications can find domain controllers. We use file replication service to replicate group policy objects that are stored in the Active Directory. So quite a sort of a complex sort of architecture. And all of this runs in a process called LSA, that is the local system authority, which is the secure process or the trusted computing base in which this runs. The best way to look at Active Directory lightweight directory services is as a surgical excision of the directory from all of these components here. So it has the directory system agent, operates in exactly the same way as before. It has an LDAP head and it has a replication head. So it doesn't have any of the old NTLM style components that we had in Active Directory. It doesn't have a security accounts manager, and it runs in a different process, in this case also called DSA main. That allows us to actually start and stop and run Active Directory lightweight directory services as a service. And in fact, just some information for you, the work that was done initially to build Active Directory lightweight directory services was the work that preceded and allowed us to now run Active Directory as a service on Windows 2008. So being able to start and stop Active Directory, that work was actually preceded by the work for Active Directory lightweight directory services. Now, some of the benefits of having both of these platforms is the skill sets for both IT pros who need to configure and deploy these, monitor the replication, is exactly the same. So if you know how to do Active Directory, you know how to do Active Directory lightweight directory services. From a developer perspective, you can use exactly the same programming tools, the same programming syntaxes to develop applications that target Active Directory or Active Directory lightweight directory services. So you get some essentially economies of scale by using a consistent set of tools for managing your directory services. And really, to me, this fits into what I call my model of IT governance. And IT governance, to me, one of the elements is removing redundant or duplicate services. I speak to lots of customers that have directories from every single vendor. And the problem there is that you then need to maintain different skill sets for managing and deploying those. If you're developing applications, each of the different LDAP directories have different programming syntaxes. So by starting to consolidate your directories at least into a fewer number of technologies, you can start to bring in some cost savings into your organization. Okay, I just got here some tables that show some of the features, some of the similarities and differences between both Active Directory and Active Directory lightweight directory services. So Active Directory lightweight directory service, I can run multiple instances on a server. Active Directory domain services, I say no, but I've got a little asterisk there. Similarly for the multiple schemas per server. There's my little pointer gone. Now the reason why I've got an asterisk there is one of the trends that's really taking off and is really beneficial to you as IT pros is virtualization. So you are quite supported in running multiple instances of a domain controller on the same physical machine in a virtualized environment. So you could conceivably have multiple domains hence an instance, and multiple schemas running on the same physical server, albeit in two different domains. Okay, but Active Directory, lightweight directory services in a single physical environment, as well as perhaps in a virtualized environment, allows you to run both multiple schemas and multiple instances on the single server. Active Directory, lightweight directory services, I can run on a client machine if I wish. The reason why I've got an asterisk there is we have not shipped Active Directory, lightweight directory services for Vista yet. So that'll be something that will come after we ship Windows Server 2008. And I mentioned that Active Directory, lightweight directory service support X500 style names. So it gives me a lot of additional benefits there when I'm thinking about other types of directory installations. Some of the things that it doesn't have is obviously all the benefits that we have with Active Directory. So for example, using it to deploy group policy, having a concept of a global catalog. Although one of the benefits of Active Directory, lightweight directory services, especially in the scenario of an application directory, for example, many of the Java enterprise applications, so WebSphere and things like that, I can backend those with a LDAP directory. However, most of those enterprise Java environments don't have the concept of a global catalog. So if I have multiple domains in a forest, they're not really good at actually querying the global catalog and being able to handle referrals. So in that situation, Active Directory, lightweight directory services allows me to aggregate all the information from all the domains into a single store, and it therefore makes a really good directory service to backend, for example, those Java enterprise platforms. It doesn't include a PKI service. It has no dependency on the DNS services, so it doesn't register DNS records, and it doesn't support the MAPI head, so we can't use Active Directory, lightweight directory services as the directory for Exchange. In the areas of similarity, there are a lot of areas of similarity. For example, obviously it supports LDAP properly, supports all the different LDAP-style program interfaces. It has a multi-master replication model, supports the INET all-person object class, extensible schema. When I'm doing an installation, I can do an installation either by using replication or by install from media. So a lot of similarities with Active Directory domain services. Okay, so how do we go about installing Active Directory, lightweight directory services? So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the binaries onto the machine. So you'll probably be aware that Windows Server 2008 gives us a much more granular mechanism in this concept called roles. So I can say this server, it only has the Active Directory, lightweight directory server role on it. So how do I get the binaries onto that server? There are two ways. If I'm using a full server, I can either use a GUI setup using the Server Manager tool, or I can use a command line setup using the Server Manager command tool. If I'm running server core, I can use OC setup to actually install the binaries on that. So that just simply installs the role. It doesn't create any instances. If I want to create an instance, I can then, on the full server, either use a graphical tool using atom install, or use an answer file to atom install and run it in that mechanism. On server core, again, I can use exactly the same mechanism using an answer file and submitting that to the atom installation utility. So you have a number of different ways of installing it and getting the binaries as well as creating instances. This is what an unattended setup file looks like. Now, let's not worry about that. We'll actually go and do a real setup. I think that makes a lot more sense. When you are actually installing this, one thing to keep in mind is under which account is it going to be running once you've got the instance installed. By default, it'll install as the network service account. Nothing wrong with that. Perfectly legitimate. In fact, the network service account was designed to run services. It has a lower set of permissions than local system, and it allows the service itself to make calls off the network, so connecting to another machine. Hence, well suited for example, when I'm using replication. Or I can explicitly set some credentials for it as a domain account. The one thing to note is you need to grant the logon as a service right to that domain account, and you would also then, if you want to generate security events or audit events, add a generate security audits right to that account as well. And finally, that account needs to have read-write access to the directory where we actually store the DIT, the directory information tree. And I've already mentioned just the two roles, the schema master and the naming master roles. So let's actually go and do a demo. Enough of me talking. Okay. So this is my Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services called SteveAd Longhorn ADLDS. The S has been cut off for some reason. And this is just the server manager tool that comes up once you've installed the machine and log on. You can see here that if I scroll down here, we'll see the different roles that have been installed on the machine. So you can see I've actually got the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services installed, that role. So I've already laid out the binaries on this machine. What we need to do next is actually create an instance. So we'll actually do this using the command line tool just to essentially show you how that works. So it's atom install contoso.txt. And let's just wait for that to complete. Doesn't take very long. In fact, while that's chugging away, let me just bring up the actual answer file itself. Just something to note there, the installation type, I can have unique or replica, so I'm creating a new unique instance. Show or hide the progress bar. I thought I'd show you a little bit of animation there. Which LDAP port and which LDAP over SSL port to listen on. So I can configure this using the non-standard ports. It doesn't have to be listening over port 389 or port 636. Which application partition to create. So you can see I'm creating a partition called organization equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain. Who's going to be the administrator for that instance? In this case, it's the Antipodes administrator. Hopefully you'll get an idea of where I come from now. One of the nice things is when you actually run the utility, it deletes whatever passwords I've actually had stored in there. So in this case, you know, who was I actually performing this installation on? And in this case, I'm also importing some LDIF files, which I'll use to extend the schema. So this actually creates a ready-to-run instance, in this case, the Contoso partition. Okay, so that's all worked correctly. And actually, just to show you some of the things, if we now do a net start, we'll actually see that there'll be a service here. You can see there, Contoso. So Contoso is my Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services service instance. It's now running that. And if we bring up, for example, the event viewer, we'll actually see that there'll be a, oops, well, I want an application log. Boom, 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 boom. That should be here somewhere. Where's the refresh? There is no refresh. Okay, let's bring that up again because there'll actually be a new log, which is the Contoso log. Obviously, this doesn't refresh it when I bring that up. So you can see that there's my Contoso log. So every time I bring up a new instance, it actually creates its own unique event log, which means it's very easy to actually monitor how that system is performing, gives you all the different events occurring for that. Okay, so we've now created an instance in the directory. That's all nice, running nicely. Let's go on now and look at what are the things we do with Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services once we've actually installed it. Okay. So the first thing is to note that by default, Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services doesn't have a fully fledged schema, it just has a base schema, enough to actually create containers. It has a top class. We can create things like organizational units, organizations, containers, just the base level classes to actually lay out the directory. But it doesn't contain, by default, leaf objects such as users or inet org person classes. So that's why I actually had an import of those LDIF files as part of my installation. I have now already extended the schema with the necessary object classes to create users and proxies and things like that. There's also a really nice tool that we include called the Atom Schema Analyzer, which one day might get named correctly to Active Directory, Lightweight Directory Services Schema Analyzer. That just doesn't roll off the tongue as easily. But it's a really great tool because it allows you to actually look at different directories, compare the schemas, and if there are any differences, create an LDIF file that you can then import into your target Active Directory, Lightweight Directory Services instance and extend its schema with the classes and attributes you've got in your other directories. So it's a really good tool for actually starting to make sure that your new instance supports exactly the same object classes and attributes as another directory does. One thing to note is, especially for the user classes, 9.org person classes, is there's some additional constructed attributes which are really helpful. If any of you have used Active Directory, you'll know that on a user object, there is an attribute called user account control, and it's a binary blob. And the way we actually work out whether an account is disabled, whether its password has expired, what privileges that account has, is by looking at different bits in that user account control attribute. Because Active Directory, Lightweight Directory Services, isn't a key distribution center, doesn't handle the same authentication that Active Directory has, it obviously doesn't have use for a thing called user account control. So we actually have some additional constructed attributes which actually expose some of those different properties. So for example, if an account has been locked because of a number of failed logon attempts, or if the account has been disabled. So these are just some easily accessible constructed attributes when you're actually accessing the directory. The ways we can extend the schema is, as I've already done, we can extend it by doing it when I create the instance, by including the LDIF files in the installation utility, either when I'm using command line by including it in that answer file, or if I'm doing this via the user interface using the graphical tool, any LDIF file that is in the Windows Atom directory will automatically be populated into the tool and give you an option for doing the installation. Or I can extend the schema after I've already set up the instance, just by simply creating either an LDIF file and importing that into the instance using the schema console tool and MMC snap-in, or in fact any other LDAP tool that writes stuff into the LDAP directory. Use exactly the same ways of accessing the schema as you do for any other information stored in the directory. We just do it over LDAP. Okay, so let's just run up and have a look at the Schema Analyzer tool, which I've forgotten the name of here. It's just called... I think we called it, yeah, AD Schema Analyzer. Thank you very much for that. Now, if I change the screen, then you get to see all my typing mistakes. So this brings up a nice little tool, very simple tool, that allows me to compare two different directories and look at the schema differences for that. So what we'll first do is we'll load the target schema. The target schema is, so we have the base, which is my schema. Well, no, the target is the schema I want to update. The base is where I want to do the comparison against. So my target schema is actually going to be my Active Directory. And that should be fine. So it's actually reading all the classes and attributes from my Active Directory instance. I can then now load up my base, which is going to be my Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance. And so it is Longhorn ADLDS port 5000. Okay, it's now done the comparison, and if I look at things like some of the classes, I know that there should be down the bottom here. So the things in red are the things where there's some mismatches. So you can see there's some different things that are missing from one to the other. If we go down, find, say, user. So we see that there's some differences in the user one. So obviously we can see here that there are some attributes that are present on my Active Directory, attributes that are not present in my Active Directory lightweight directory services. So we can see some different things here. So what I could do if I wish to then is select the user object, to a file, and create an LDIF file. Okay, it'll then just go through and automatically create an LDIF file that has the differences between the two, so then I can actually load and import that LDIF file into my Active Directory lightweight directory services instance, and then I can actually use exactly the same attributes and classes in both of those different directories. We actually won't go through and finish that. Okay, so that's the schema. Next important thing is users and groups. So exactly the same way that Active Directory works, we create objects in the directory. The important thing is for the standard classes like a user, an inet.org person, and also this other class of users called proxies, we need to obviously have imported and extended the schema with those object classes. Once we've actually extended the directory, we can then use any of our normal tools to actually add objects into the directory. You know, we can use ADSI edit, LDP, LDIF, any of the provisioning tools, anything that talks LDAP, you can use to obviously create and manage objects in the directory. There's also some additional roles in an Active Directory lightweight directory services instance. The three built-in roles are administrator, users, and readers. The best way of visualizing those is exactly the same as the built-in groups in Active Directory, like administrators, domain admins, users, things like that. By default, if I actually want to have a user being able to access information in a Active Directory lightweight directory services instance, they need to be added to one of those roles. Otherwise, they don't have permissions to read the directory. Obviously, when I'm doing administration of the directory, I need to bind to the directory, and that then allows me to manage the properties in there, add users to groups, enable, disable accounts, set passwords, and things like that. The other important thing to note is, if you recall, when I did the installation of the instance, I specified that Antipodes administrator was the administrator of that instance. If I want to allow a Active Directory lightweight directory services user to be an administrator of the instance, I need to create their account not in the application partition, but I need to create it in the configuration partition. That I then add them to the administrator's role in the configuration partition, and then they have permissions to administer the instance itself. So for example, managing the replication topology, doing things like that. Now, I introduced this concept of a user proxy. So there's a couple of different classes of users that we need to understand in terms of the directory. First of all, we have a normal Active Directory lightweight directory services user. So in this case, I've got a user called Jane Smith, and you can see that that's the distinguished name, so it's in the Contoso partition, and she's a user object. I can also create a user, and in this case, it's Joe Smith. He's actually in my Antipodes domain. I actually give him an object or a distinguished name belonging into here. So what this really means is I can allow both objects that reside in my Active Directory lightweight directory instance or a user that's in my Active Directory domain. I can grant them both permissions to the directory. Finally, just to sort of make things a little bit more confusing, I can create a user proxy. So in this case, the user proxy is a proxy class. The user logs on with the distinguished name in that container. However, it actually proxies them across and compares their credentials in Active Directory. So the real difference is, if Jane Smith logs on, she uses her credentials that are stored in Active Directory lightweight directory services. If Joe Smith logs on with those credentials, he logs on with his credentials that are stored in Active Directory. So this allows us to allow both Active Directory lightweight directory users and Active Directory domain users to have permissions to both access the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance. So let's go and create some users. So the first thing we'll do is we'll bring up our LDP tool. So during the course of this morning, we're going to go through and use a number of the different tools we've got for Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. So one thing just to note here is I'm connecting into my server. You'll notice I'm connecting in onto port 5000, okay? So just be aware that when you configure Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, by default, you don't have to use port 389. You can configure any free port that you wish to use. So we're connecting to that, and you can see that I get the normal root DSA, the root directory service subschema entry information. So we've now got a connection to this. Let's now just bind as the administrator. Okay, so I've now been authenticated, and let's have a look at the tree. So you can see I've got my configuration namespace, my schema namespace. You can see there's that horrible GUID at the end of there, which uniquely identifies them. And I've got my application partition, in this case, organisation equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain. So that's an X500 style naming syntax. And you can see that there's not much in the directory. I've got a lost and found container. I've got my directory services quotas container, and I've got the roles. So remember, the roles are the built-in groups: administrators, readers, and users. So the first thing we'll do is let's just create an OU in the directory. So we'll create a child. OU equals finance, object class is organizational unit. Enter, run. So I've now created an organizational unit called finance. Okay, pretty simple. Next thing we'll do is let's actually add a user. So it's going to be a child, and let's add Maynard Keynes, very famous economist. I don't know what he'd make of the US subprime mortgage crisis, but I'll leave that to the experts. Object class is a user. And let's actually fill out some properties for Maynard Keynes. So we'll give him his given name is Maynard. Surname is Keynes. Let's give him a description. Economist. And let's give him an email address. m.keynes, how about it, money.com. You have to have a sense of humour when you're doing these demonstrations. Okay, so just to show you what I've got there, object class user, given name, surname, description, and a mail address. Okay, let's go and run that. Create the user there. So that works the way you'd sort of expect it to work. Okay, we need to give the user a password. Okay, forgot about that one. So let's go and modify the user. Okay, so we do a modify, and we'll do user password, and we'll put in a secret password. Just one thing to note, in Active Directory, user passwords are stored in an attribute called Unicode password. In Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, they're stored in an attribute called user password. In Active Directory, Unicode password, you can only write to it, you can never read from it. In Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, by default also, you can only write to it, you can't read from it. However, there's a registry setting that does allow you to extract the passwords from that attribute, and that's really designed for applications where they actually need to retrieve, say, a hash of the password. For example, in Java, the Jindy, the LDAP login module, expects to be able to retrieve passwords so we can actually do the comparison. Okay, let's go and run that. Oh, okay, I don't know whether you can see that. We've got an error here, illegal modify operation. Okay, don't fret, it's all designed as part of the demo. So one of the things, as you know, one of the important settings in Active Directory Lightweight Services is by default to try and make it as secure as possible out of the box. So that means we only allow password operations over encrypted connections and other things like that. So let's actually go through and loosen up the security just for the purpose of this demo. If you're doing this in a real live production environment, you would actually install SSL certificates and actually perform password operations over a SSL or TLS connection. Okay, so we use DSMGMT. This is again one of the tools which I'll talk about later on. Just to give you an idea of some of the different things we've got here. We can configure the behavior of the directory service. It's being a badly behaved directory. We can configure different settings for it. These are some of the tools or some of the options you would have seen in NTDS util if you were using those tools against Active Directory domain services. So we need to go and change the behavior. I need to connect to my server, connect to server Steve-Ad Longhorn ADLDS port 5000. Okay, go back up one level and list current DS behavior. How was it again? List current DS. Oh, okay, list current DS. Okay. So it shows that password operations on unsecured connections are denied. So let's just loosen up the security. Allow password op on unsecured connection. Okay, so I'm now allowing password operations to be done over not just SSL or TLS connections, but also over a clear LDAP connection. That's all we need to do here. And if we go back to our LDAP tool and run that again, we can now see that we've now updated the password on that user. So let's just go and actually see if we can do a query. So I've got just a very simple application here that I've written using system.directory services, a very simple .NET application, just does a very basic search. So ADLDS, port 5000, we'll do a connection. Okay, we want the Contoso thing, and CN equals Maynard Keynes, organizational unit equals finance, O equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain, and the secret password. Okay, invalid credentials. I must have mistyped. What have I done? What have I typed wrong? Aha, thank you very much. It's great when you've got an audience that are watching. I think I mistyped the password. Oh, okay. Ah, no. What am I talking about? It's meant to do that. Okay. Because if we look at Maynard Keynes, account is disabled, okay? When I first created the account, didn't have a password, by default, the account was disabled. So let's actually go and enable the account. Okay, so we need to set, modify MSDS user account disabled to false. And this is a replace operation. Okay, so we've now modified that. And we do a search, 0 entries. Okay, I've just created an entry called Maynard Keynes in there. Why can't I see it? Quite obvious. Because I haven't added Maynard Keynes to any of the groups, the built-in groups. So even though he's successfully logged on, he can't actually see any of the groups or any of the objects because he's not added to a group that has permissions to read the directory. So let's go and add him to a group. I'll just bring up ADSI Edit. Again, just another one of the tools we have. Again, if you've been using Active Directory, you're probably familiar with ADSI Edit, nice graphical tool. There you can see I've got my connection to my Antipodes domain. Let's actually create a new connection to our Contoso instance. So we set the server. The server is going to be stevad Longhorn ADLDS port 5000. Oops, wrong button. stevad Longhorn ADLDS port 5000, and we'll call it Contoso, and the distinguished name is going to be O equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain. So there's my connection to Contoso. So you can see I've got my finance users, okay, Maynard Keynes. So let's go and actually add him to a role. We'll add him to the readers role. We'll edit this, add a distinguished name. Maynard Keynes, OU equals finance, O equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain. And actually, while we're here, we'll add a Windows account. I'm just going to add users. So anybody that is in the Antipodes domain in their users, which is just actually one of the built-in groups, everybody's in that by default, we'll add this to the group as well. So we can check the names. Okay. Okay. So now you can see that we've added Maynard Keynes and users to the built-in role in the instance called readers. Okay, apply, okay. So if we go back to our little application, do the search again, we'll get one object. So what we've done here is we've created a user, loosened up some of the policies to allow a password operation to occur over a unsecure connection, which is a bad security practice, but okay for the purpose of this demo. And we can also, add those users to roles and configure the other settings, such as whether the account's disabled and things like that. Okay. One last thing just to go through is I want to show how I can authenticate into the directory using a normal Windows account. So just bear with me because I didn't configure that little application to use Windows account, so I'll just go and run a script. IT forum demo, CNADSI. Let me just move this to the top of the screen for you. C script page.vbs. This is just a very simple ADSI application that also accesses the directory. Paged search. Okay, stevad Longhorn ADLDS port 5000. Context is Contoso, Great Britain. We'll just do actually I'll show you how it works for Maynard Keynes. A simple bind CN equals Maynard Keynes, OU equals finance. When you get old, you talk to yourself. O equals Contoso, country equals Great Britain. Password was our secret password. And it generates one result. Let's actually run that again. Okay, we'll connect to the port, same context. We'll now do a secure bind, and the user in this case is my user called Albert Einstein in my Antipodes domain. And he again gets those results. So this is just demonstrating that I can use both a user that I've defined in my Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance and a user that's been defined in my Active Directory domain. Okay. Next thing to go on through is to introduce this concept of a user proxy. So a user proxy is an object that I find in my Active Directory Lightweight Directory instance, but the authentication occurs by my domain. So I submit my credentials, I put in my username as my Active Directory Lightweight Directory Service instance name, but my password is actually the password in Active Directory. So it proxies the authentication across. So let's actually go and create a proxy user. So let's have a look at Albert Einstein. He's actually a user in my Antipodes domain in the research OU. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let's actually just show you the properties. So one of the properties in a normal Active Directory object is the object SID. And you see there that it's one of those horrible S-1 numbers. That's the normal format for an Active Directory security identifier. So let's actually go and create a user proxy. Let's just collapse this. So again, we'll do it in the finance OU, a new object. We're going to use the ADSI edit wizard to do this. We'll create a user proxy. And so it'll be Albert Einstein proxy. And we just need to put in one attribute, which is the object SID, which is actually the thing that provides the link to the real object in the Active Directory domain. So if we look at the man tree attributes, we've got the object SID. Okay, I'm not going to type in all that horrible S stuff. That's just far too hard for me to do. In fact, it just uses a hex representation. So let me just copy and paste it from here. That's what it looks like in its hex representation. If any of you want to actually ask me later how you actually decode those sort of things, I would happily do that for you. And we'll do a set, OK, and finish. So we've now created a proxy object that simply links this object in the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Service instance to the user object in Active Directory. And if we go back to our little application here, okay, Albert Einstein proxy OU equals finance, and I'll put in my Windows password and perform my search. Okay, I've got another error message. Okay, again, as I said, Active Directory by default is secure. So it won't allow me to actually perform proxy connections over an unsecured connection. So let's go back and loosen up one other security setting. So we go into DSMGMT, configurable settings. So just give you all the commands here. We can list the different configurable settings. Oops. Connect to server SteveAd Longhorn ADLDS port 5000. Click list. These are all the different settings. Show values. So you can see that require secure proxy bind is set to 1. So it means that if I'm doing a proxy connection, it has to be done again over a SSL or TLS connection. Let's just loosen that up again for the purpose of this demonstration. Set value require secure proxy bind to 0. Don't you hate that the U key is next to the I key? Oops, I just need to do set. Boom. Show value. See it's got 1, which is the current value, 0, which is the proposed value. Commit changes. Okay, now so I've loosened up that security setting. Quit. So if we go back to our little demo application, do a search here. Okay, this is actually just a bug in my application because I don't clear the text box, but I've now successfully done a search, in this case using a proxy object and using my Windows domain password, which actually goes and gets proxied across to the domain controller. Okay. So we've got that all to work properly. So just a couple of things in terms of just to summarize and connecting to the directory. Okay, exactly the same as Active Directory. It doesn't allow anonymous logon by default. If you want to allow that, just go and set bit 7 of the DS heuristics bit. And as I've showed you, simple binds, you can set, you can configure the ability to deny unsecure binds using the DS management tool. Similarly for password operations, secure proxies, things like that. I've showed you the concept of roles, which are just like the built-in groups, which allow a user to get access to the directory. One thing I haven't shown you is access control entries. Again, you configure access control entries exactly the same way in Active Directory. If I want to give a user specific permissions on an object, or even down to the attribute level, I just simply set an access control entry on that specific object. In terms of auditing, again, you set auditing exactly the same way in Active Directory. I obviously define the policy to audit the events for that. And again, I set a SACL, a static access control list entry, on the objects that I want to have generate audit events. And finally, password policies. It inherits the password policies either from the domain, if it's installed on a member server, or it'll use the password policies that have been set on a individual server if it's just running in workstation mode. Or again, there's a registry setting to say, don't worry about inheriting the password policies. So you have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you configure password policies on Active Directory lightweight directory services. Okay, just go through some of the different tools we've got. I've shown you Atom install and Atom uninstall. They're the tools we use to actually create instances. We've looked at the ADSI edit tool, which is a nice graphical tool to add and change entries in the directory. LDP, which is a very raw tool, but very useful, especially when you want to look up the explicit objects and the attribute values. We've looked at DS management, which is a subset of some of the NTDS utilities to allow me to configure the settings on this. I'll look at DS DB util in a second. We use repadmin in exactly the same way as we use repadmin on Active Directory to monitor the replication, to look at the replication metadata on the objects. LDIFDE, CSVDE to import and export objects in the directory. DSACLs to set the access control entries. DSDiag to check the health of it. The schema analyzer tool that we looked at. And we'll also be looking at Atom Sync. DSDButil is a very handy tool. We use that to change the service account. We use it to change the ports if we need to reconfigure the instance. It also does some of the database utility services that were in NTDS util, such as the semantic database analysis. So it's doing things like calling into ESE in a util and performing that. We also use it to perform authoritative restores. One of the new things that's actually in Windows Server 2008, which is the ability to take snapshots of the directory and to mount those snapshots using a tool called DSA main. So I'll show you that in a second. So this is just a summary of things we can do with DS management, which we've already done. Atom Sync is a really great little tool. It allows me to synchronize Active Directory lightweight directory services with an Active Directory instance. So it's a very simple tool, allows me to take objects from one directory and synchronize those objects with the instance. It's not a heavyweight tool, so it doesn't do things such as very complex transformations of one attribute type to another attribute type. It doesn't allow me to do transforms and say, take all the users in this organizational unit here and move them about into different organizational units based on different characteristics. So it's a very simple synchronization tool. It has a very simple XML configuration file, which is quite easy to configure and use. It does do some simple transformations between different user classes. So I can actually take a user object in Active Directory and generate the user proxies in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. We can include and exclude different attributes, and these are just some of the commands we'll use with that. We'll actually go and run this. This is just an example of the configuration file, and just some things to note is we've got the organization here, different attributes to include and exclude, quite simple to use. So let's just do a quick demo of using Atom Sync. Okay. So first thing we'll do is we'll install a configuration file. My server port 5000, and the file we use is contoso user.xml. Okay. The audience has fallen asleep. They didn't catch my typo. Okay, so I've got an error in the user file. So let's actually have a look at the file and see what the error is. Notepad contoso user.xml. Oh. Okay, so this is just a file, so I've got just a description of what this installation does, what the source partition is, so my antiquities domain, partition information, my target, contoso. Okay, where am I going to do the query from? Take all the marketing users. Here's a object filter. Now, if any of you understand LDAP queries, geez, that looks like a perfectly valid LDAP query to me. Just the one thing to note is because this is an XML file and it's being parsed by an XML parser, the ampersand character is actually a special XML character. So we just need to change that to ampersand. Save that. Let's run it again. And that actually installs the instance. Let's actually just list the instances we've got there. Oops. List. Okay, we've got one instance there. So let's actually go and run that. We'll do a sync. And we put in the instance name, contoso, country equals Great Britain. It's now doing a very quick query, finding all the users with the first name of John in my marketing OU and moving those across. And if we go to ADSI edit and refresh this guy, you'll see we've now got a marketing OU with all the users called John in there. Okay, just one thing to note, those users were carried across, but they obviously haven't got a password set, and they by default would have their user account disabled. Okay, that's now created valid users, in this case in my marketing OU. Let's now just go and show you how you can do exactly the same, but to create a user proxy object. Okay, so to do a user proxy object, I've got a different file here, userproxy.xml, and we can show you the list of that. So I've got this case a Atom Sync configuration file to create user proxies. I'll just show you what the file looks like. Pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is I'm actually just including some different attributes to carry across, and I've got a user proxy entry here that says anything that's a object class user in the target in the source directory, convert that to a user proxy object in my target directory. So that's all we're doing here. It automatically creates the user proxy objects for me. Okay, so now let's go and do a sync of that. It takes a little bit longer to do the sync because it's actually got to do the transformation and create the user proxy objects, but that's all done. If we now go and look into ADSI edit, go into my finance, You see the OU there, and all the users have been copied across as user proxies. So Atom Sync is a very simple tool to allow me to create those user proxy objects. Okay? And in fact, just to show you that it really does work, let's go, actually, okay, just, hopefully you'll appreciate that it's not going to clear out the text box there. So we can log in as, so there was a user called Andrew Adams, OU equals information systems, and he actually has a very long password because in that Active Directory partition, I actually am using fine-grained password policies and have set a very long password for that user. Very long password, and does a search and now has retrieved all those users. So that's just showing that I've created a user proxy object and he correctly logs in and gets access to the directory. Okay. From a programmatic aspect, just think of Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services as a LDAP compatible directory. You can use any programming interface you wish to get access to the directory. So you can use the old LDAP-C APIs, you can use ADSI, which we've used in the past. In fact, that little command line tool we were using before is based on ADSI. My little graphical tool that I was just showing you there, I wrote that using the .NET framework, using the system.directoryservices.protocols namespace. If you're using Internet Information Services in ASP.NET, there's actually a membership provider that actually has the pre-contained components that allow you to build a web page, store the user objects in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, and use that as the membership service. And you can also access it directly from Java. So there's nothing to stop you from using any programming platform whatsoever to access and store information in Active Directory. So for example, in fact this is even showing you using PowerShell. So PowerShell actually supports the ADSI namespace or type. Simply do queries against the Active Directory using that. I can use it using, in this case, Java. In fact, rather than show you on screen what it looks like, why don't we actually show you accessing this using Java. So, just back to this, Telnet, Ubuntu, switch screens, thank you very much. Okay. We're all supposed to say, ooh, it's Linux. Okay, so go into my Java directory, my JNDI directory, Atom, and I've got a couple of different classes there. One is using the page results control. So let's just do that. Java paged. It just does a very simple search against the directory using the page results. So just bring in pages of 10. One of the things that I really like is one of the things we've got in Active Directory and in Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services is the virtual list view control. Essentially, if any of you have used Exchange and you go into your Exchange address book, it just brings up a number of objects. You can type in a user's name, it'll then move down in the address book. The virtual list view control gives me exactly the same capabilities over LDAP. Remember, Exchange is using MAPI, but LDAP using the virtual list view control gives me this sort of cursor interface into the directory. So I've written exactly the same functionality using Java and JNDI. So I can do Java virtual list view alpha. This is using the alphanumeric names. Does a query in that. And so it's come up, I've just based that on a user starting with John. I can type in A, it'll go to the first part of the entries. I can go to W, goes to the end, T, I think there's a user called Terry. Is there any bills there? So you can see it's just simply providing me with a cursored view into the directory. And this is just using Java. So hopefully this goes to show that Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services is just an LDAP compatible directory that works with any of the programming languages that support LDAP. Okay. Anything else to cover? Okay, we've shown you how we can do that. Actually, before I close on the summary, there's just one thing I want to finish up on. I did mention using DSDB util to create snapshots. So I've got a couple of minutes to go, so we'll actually go and just do that. I like having fun. Okay. 0 to exit that guy. Exit. Don't need that anymore. Let's go back to this. Okay. So what we need to do is run DSDB util. This is a tool that allows me to, to perform all the database analysis. So if I need to, do compaction of my DIT, if I want to do semantic analysis, making sure that it's not corrupted, things like that, that's the tool that I use to perform that. It's a subset of some of the utilities you had in NTDS util. One of the nice new features in this, however, is the ability to create snapshots using the volume shadow copy service. So just to give you a look, here's all the different commands here. You can see that this is where I actually can change the LDAP port, list the instances, things like that. So let's show you list instance. Okay, we've got our Contoso instance. That shows me where the location of the database files are. Activate instance Contoso. Okay, we've now got a snapshot directory. List all. Okay, there shouldn't be any snapshots. Oh, there is a snapshot there. Okay, let's do a snapshot. Creates a snapshot. Okay, takes a little bit of a while to do the snapshot. And you can see we've got this snapshot there. It's got a horrible GUID. You don't have to remember the GUIDs. It's just far too much like hard work. Okay, what we're interested in is the one that had exactly the same GUID, which was the 92AE, which is number 3. So what I can do is I can do mount 3, and it now mounts that volume, and you can see there's this sort of horrible path. That's actually a junction point in my file system. And the important thing to note here is we just need to see what the date is. So the date and time is 11/16/09/11. So just to make things really easy, okay, 16. What was the 09/11? You can tell that I haven't actually set my clock on this machine to this time. It's set back on UK time. 09/11. Oh, 9/11. Okay, so now what I can do is exit out of that, and I now run DSA main. DSA main, if you remember, was actually the service that runs the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance. So let's actually go and run this. Okay, so it's running DSA main. I use the path to my snapshot, tell it what LDAP port I want it to listen on, in this case 6000, tell it it's actually a Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance, and off it goes. It's now running. So if I now go to my tool like LDAP, we do a connect, disconnect from my previous session, connect new just to clean things up, connect, to port 6000. So hopefully we'll see port 6000 there. We'll connect, and I've now got a running instance of that snapshotted Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance. And if we go and do a bind and a view tree, you can see we've got all the objects there. So what I've done is I've actually used the snapshotting service to take a snapshot of that running instance. I've then mounted that as a junction point, started another instance of DSA main, and now I can listen to that on, in this case, port 6000. A really great tool for doing things such as if you want to do auditing and you want to have a historical collection of all the events or status of everything that you've had in the directory. So if you've got a very high regulatory compliance, you can take a snapshot, say, every day, and then you can say, when the auditors come and say, well, who had access or what were the users in your directory on that day? You can bring up that snapshot and say, oh, okay, here they all are. So it's a really great tool for managing your audit compliance requirements. Also, it's a really great tool, I won't say for disaster recovery, but for disaster recovery. In terms of when you've accidentally deleted an object and you need to restore the object, obviously you can reanimate objects because of the tombstones, but a tombstone doesn't maintain all of the attributes you've had in that object. So you can then take the attributes from that object, like maybe their email address, telephone number, things like that, and bring those across into the recovered instance. So it really helps you support some of those disaster recovery scenarios. Okay, so that was doing that. So just to summarize, it doesn't replace Active Directory, it complements it. Because I can then use this for instances where I want to have an application that has its own specific schema. And many organizations are loath to extend their Active Directory schema because of fears, because it's become an important part of the network, people just don't want to mess with the schema. So I can set up a Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services instance, populate that with my users, have its own custom schema, use that for an application without impacting the rest of my Active Directory domain. We're certainly positioning it as a replacement for third-party LDAP directories, such as Sun1 Directory Server, Novell Z Directory, OpenLDAP. Simply because if you've got a skill set that's used to using Active Directory today, why duplicate the skills and tools to manage two different LDAP directories that require two different skill sets? That just increases your costs. So if you can start to merge or converge those directories into a single set of technologies, you can reduce your costs and improve the utilization of those directories by developers and applications. The other important thing is, because it's based on Active Directory, all the knowledge you've got on Active Directory, such as deployment, monitoring, third-party tools that you use to monitor the directory, you can reuse those skills. So it really allows you to really harness the existing knowledge you've got in your own organization. Okay, related sessions. Unfortunately, this is Friday. A lot of the sessions have passed. However, after this session, I know that Stephanie has her Active Directory Domain Services session. So if you want to learn about the big brother to Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, go to Stephanie's session after this. Some resources there for you. These are just some things where you can get access to information on the internet. From a programmer's perspective, there's the Identity and Access Management Developer Center that discusses how you program against the Active Directory and does things in terms of how you can build, for example, ASP.NET membership providers. With that, don't forget to fill in your evaluation form. Really important, not just for my own sort of ego, but more important for the organizer of the event, so they know that this session is worthwhile and they run it in future events. With that, thank you very much for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.